fixed up all the points he suggested and worked. Oh, this is interesting. Here's SRL ad from Dick Matheson again. He's fixed up all the points he suggested and worked out a moderately new ending. Far be it from me to tell you how to run your magazine, with which you've been doing a pretty damn nice job yourself. But personally, I like the old ending better. Therefore, I'm including the first version here also, so you may compare the two, and I do hope you'll wind up with a judicious combination of the two versions. But that, of course, is up to you. And Mitch McConnell strikes back. Dear Harry, SRL ad is okay, save for an occasional touch of blue pencil, which I hope you and Dick will okay. I can't agree with you that the first version is better. Anthony and I think the second infinitely better. The thing I like about Dick is his ability to grasp the essentials of a rewrite job and execute them well. So that's SRL ad. Dress of white silk between Boucher and Harry Alseward. Dear Harry, I've read Dick Matheson's Dress of White Silk several times, and I'm kind of bothered by it. I quite agree with you as to its general excellence and impact, but I have a lot of small worries. A, I gather Mama is a vampire. Well, what became of her? This gets complicated, because she must have given birth to the child while she was alive. Then she died and became a vampire. Then she somehow got destroyed as a vampire, and now she's back and haunting her old room. It's all pretty confusing. B, what's a mirror doing in a vampire's room? That's one thing they cannot bear, almost as bad as garlic or crosses. C, I don't get the implication of the smelling bags and leaves in the box with Mama's dress. D, I guess Mary Jane, quote, I guess she'll come tomorrow on page 2 is definitely inconsistent and unfair. If this can all be somehow clarified so that everything will fall into place exactly with that wonderful last line, it could be a fine story. Maybe you'd like to show Dick this letter and decide between you whether to do any revisions or try it elsewhere. So, Matheson, responding to getting this feedback through his agent, writes back to his agent. Dear Harry, about Tony's letter, to be frank, I never thought one way or the other about what Mama was. I vaguely thought about werewolf or vampire. Of course, I can see now that vampire is out, but I'd rather have it werewolf anyway, if it must be something like that. Idyllically, I'd like to not worry about what the gimmick is, not to have such a pat explanation about it. The fact that the little girl has eaten part of her friend is the only point I meant to leave out. But naturally, Tony is right. If he thought it was a vampire, then others might too, and they would be bothered by the same apparent inconsistencies. So because I definitely would like the story in the magazine of fantasy, I'll do whatever I can to make it what Tony thinks it should be. By that I mean I'll remove whatever inconsistencies it appears to have. I don't really know how, and would appreciate if you'd ask him to give me a few concrete suggestions. I wouldn't know where to start since I don't know what part of the supernatural phenomenon to settle on as the gimmick. However, I'll be glad to work on it. And Tony writes back, this is January 26, 1951. We're still just a year into Matheson's career. Dear Dick, I'm very pleased to hear you want to rework Dress of White Silk, which I think is potentially one of your best. Seems to me that the main trouble is that, as you say in your letter to Harry, you just thought vaguely about werewolf or vampire. If you have a fixed, definite pattern in the back of your mind when you tackle the rewrite, the clarity will probably take care of itself without any need of being too specific. As you agree, the vampire is out, doesn't fit into this pattern. So let's make Mama some kind of were-creature, and it doesn't need to be stated just what. In fact, it might be good just before the end to give a little girl a hint of something like, and it's silly what they say in books. You don't have to change inside. You don't have to change outside. It's all inside, which gives a fresh approach to wareness. You invented that word. For one specific clue, you might have Mary Jane taught her about how silly she looks with her long ring finger when everybody knows people's middle fingers are longest. No, that's stressing it a little too much. My phrasing, I mean. But some reference to the werewolf's characteristic ring finger of the same length as the middle finger might help. I'd like a little more clarity on the symbolism of the dress itself and the things in the box with it, but since I'm not at all certain what you have in mind there, I can't be specific. Does this seem enough to tackle it? And Matheson says, thanks for the letter. As you suggest, I'll assume Mama will be some kind of were-creature who does not necessarily change on the outside. I'll work in that ring finger idea. I never knew that before. As to the dress, I'll try and make clearer what I mean. I had visualized that what was left of Mama's powers were in the dress she had once worn during those times she traipsed around digesting the good citizens of the town. The leaves and smell bags were meant to be some sort of abortive power like garlic with the vampire. I'll see if I can bring it out better. Thanks again for the letter. Best, Dick. P.S. Just looked at my own hand. Ye gads. How are we doing on time? Man, I finished quick. That's kind of what I had. I wanted to, sort of cover the early period and share a bit of the back and forth with the letters. Those are in. There's a little more of those in the Suntup book if you can find it. And I acquired an archive of correspondence between Matheson and George Haas many years ago, which I plucked a lot of those out and spent some time there. Syracuse and the Ray Bradbury Center and the University of Missouri. I lived in Columbia. Matheson went to school there. And there are archives in all of those places that contain correspondence between Matheson and various people. And I went through those and copies a lot of that stuff for the Suntup book. And for this book, there's some stuff in the Columbia stuff in that book. And just found it all really fascinating to be able to kind of peek behind the curtain and see what was going on, during this early part of Matheson's career. I have something else here let me say about this. Graveyard shift. This was just an interesting little thing that I found when we were doing research for the companion. This story was the fake. I must have skipped over it. Let me flip back and find it. I was afraid I was going to run out of time, but I guess there's no chance of that. So here, this is a letter from Matheson to his creative writing professor. Dear Bill, in your class I once wrote a story in the form of 3 letters concerning a mother who had hated her son, made him frightened of everything in the world but her, then killed herself, leaving him in terror. Now, some 12 years later, the story, slightly revised, is in the first issue of Ed McBain's mystery book under the title of The Faces. And what was interesting about that is when this story was republished in one of the shock magazines, it appeared under the title Graveyard Shift, which is kind of curious because it doesn't really seem to be an apt title for the story. And when I was digging around when we were writing the companion, I found out why. In Ed McBain's mystery book, they have various sort of sections or departments, like the letters to the editor and this sort of thing. And one of their departments is called Graveyard Shift. And The Faces by Richard Matheson was the story in that section of the digest. And somebody, when they were, preparing it for reprint, grabbed Graveyard Shift as the title, and that's what it wound up as in the shock magazine.
Seems hard to believe that, Richard wasn't at some point, allowed to look at the galleys and say, hey, wait a minute, that's not the name of the story.
I know. It's kind of funny. But these errors occur. It was also, it was reprinted in Shock 2, I had here when it was first reprinted, and then also at some point as Day of Reckoning. So, what have you got, Matthew?
A few things. First of all, in terms of the short stories in general, I think it's interesting to see how neatly Matheson's career breaks down into different phases. Too big a word, but he wrote endlessly short stories for the first 20 years, leading up to Duel, which was not his last short story, but essentially, he essentially stopped writing at that point. The later ones were either older stories that hadn't been published for some reason, or I guess he wrote, a handful later on, but that was essentially it.
A lot of them were, I think, those things that were rejected by Shades and Comments and never saw the light of day. It was a Gauntlet resurrected.
That I'm sure is overwhelmingly true. There are various reasons why he stopped with the stories. I think the primary one was, as usual, logistical, financial, practical, whatever you want to call it. Most of the magazines that he'd been writing for so actively back in the 50s and early 60s either had ceased to exist, and the money he would make from having something published in those that remained just wasn't enough to justify doing it. So he was also doing, by that point, plenty of film work, which was much more lucrative, even not necessarily as creatively satisfying. And so he just said, enough of the short stories, moving on. Interestingly, Duel, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, was a turning point of another kind, because when he adapted it into the Steven Spielberg film, that was his first TV movie, an area in which he could be said to have considerable success in the 70s with the trilogy of Terror, Night Stalker, etc. So sort of the old, one door closes, another one opens scenario. I'm glad you brought up SRL ad, because it is part of a phenomenon, something that I find interesting, and I don't think too many people are aware of. Early in his career, he wrote a number of stories which he set at a fictional college, which he called Fort College, which was named after Charles Fort, the writer, whose work inspired his story, Witch War. I don't know how big a fan he was of Charles Fort's syndrome. I know after actual people called the Fortians, who were huge followers of his. I don't think Richard was one of those. Maybe you know from his story.
I do know of it. He actually was not familiar with Charles Fort until he started corresponding with George Haas. And Haas was described himself as a Fortian. And he's like, you need to read this guy. And he sent him some, newsletters from a Fortian group that existed at the time. And Matheson responded and said he found them quite interesting. He said, I consider myself a Fortian now. And as you say, Witch War was definitely cribbed from some of Fort's work. And I'll just say, since I do live in Columbia, Missouri, that Fort College was based on the university. Is that yours?
Have a little patience.
I'm getting all right.
Just wanted to start with Fort, okay? Holding the fort. So, and yes, when I wrote an article about him, through Easter, that's what I call it. The physical campus of Fort College was in fact based on the University of Missouri, which he had attended.
I didn't know that.
Oh, no. Shut up. The interesting thing is, he never had any kind of, serious character or anything like that. I don't think he ever wrote for himself a sequel to anything, unless I'm drawing a blank here. But he did do this set of short stories, and even within that, I think there are 11 of them, or something like that. There are 3 stories that depict the faculty's rather mixed success with time travel. Some of them very ill-fated. But the rest of them, there's no community characters. There really is just this campus, and there's this one big building that's, it's like a big black obelisk or something. He always seems to mention that when he's going through the physical sciences buildings. But other than that, not only are they not in any other way related except for the setting, but they are an intriguingly diverse cross-section of styles, tones. I mean, SRL ad, which Paul mentioned, is basically an epistolary story, except instead of being letters, it's these SRL ads, and it's very whimsical and, and so forth. Some of the other stories are a bit more bleak and as I say, different in every way. So I always say, if you want to look at how diverse the stories were in style, tone, etc. at that time, all you need to do is look at these 4 college stories, and there you go.
There was a plan at one point to publish them all in a collection. Is that, you're coming up to that?
Oh, I may or may not have mentioned that. Yes, it's true. They've never been collected. I hope they get you to write the intro. They do. But there was a specific plan that apparently, who was it? Borderlands Press. Fell through, never happened. So if you out there are looking for something to publish, there's their answer. But the most of them appeared in the first 5 years of his career in various magazines, and I think that was, he said people were never really aware that he was trying to do a series. And I think part of that was because most of them appeared in totally different magazines. I think there were 2 magazines that published 2 of them each, Thrilling Wonder Stories and Fantastic, but the rest of them were all spread out all over the place. One of them only appeared for the first time in Born and the collection. And then one of them, wisely, I think, was not published until Matheson Uncollected, Volume 2 in 2010. Because an element never forgets. And if you think that title is a little precious, you have no idea. The story is like the biggest Shaggy Dog story you can imagine, and I can see why that was such. Pop! So we did those. So that was an interesting, as I said, I don't think a lot of people are aware of that. One of them also has the distinction of trespass, or otherwise protest, as the editress called it, which was published in Fantastic, was the basis for The Stranger Within, the TV movie he did in the 70s with Barbara Eden, surprisingly effective in a dramatic role, as a woman who was basically impregnated from space by aliens, and there's a sort of Elizabeth thing where the unborn child affects her, and etc. So that's, which is actually a very good film. So but most of the stories they're interesting. They're not that well known, and of course it's worth noting that many of these short stories were adapted for the screen in one form or another. I make it 36. I'm sure you're confident. Fully half of which he actually adapted himself. So they were turned into things like Twilight Zone episodes and so forth. So he had a pretty good track record in terms of getting a lot of his stories adapted to the screens. I think that's all I have on the top of my head.
Just a couple of comments. I will mention, I have a poster up here on the table, which I invite all of you to come look at. I'm thinking of producing them, and so if you're in the business cards out here too. So if you're interested, visit the website and tell me you're interested. It has a new piece of artwork by Harry O. Morris, and then there's a list of everything Matheson ever wrote. All the short stories, novels, screenplays, everything is listed on here, and it's a different color for every type of thing. And to Matthew's point, if you look at this, the short stories are in green, so you'll see them, green, heavily occupying this first column here, and then starts to be sort of sprinkled around, and that this kind of gives you a visual idea of Matheson's career and what he was doing over time, and what things were sort of occupying certain decades and things like that.
And by the way, I also find it interesting that over those 20 years, when he was for the most part doing the stories, he only, and you could debate it only, but he only published 8 novels, which is not that many.
Right.
And I know in between 1960, with Beardless Warriors, and Hell House in 1971, he didn't publish any novels. And I know that was mostly because he was doing screen work. But again, it's like the predominance of the short stories versus novels over that time. I find that interesting.
It is interesting. I do have some letters here, just some comments from him about wood writing. Even as early as November 1951, he wrote to George Hobson and said, "Pretty soon now comes the horrible day when I must try to write short stories again. I have plenty of ideas, but little faith in my immediate ability to bring them out. We'll see." And in 1959, this letter came from his creative writing professor, William Keaton, wrote to Matheson. He said, "Dear Dick, I hope you'll be interested to hear that Story Magazine plans to resume publication as a quarterly early in 1960. Whit and Hallie Burnett and I will be the editors, and should be very pleased to have a story of yours for the first, or at least for a very early issue." And Matheson replied a few days later, Dear Bill, I was very pleased to get your note, equally pleased to see that you are one of the editors of the new story. I wish I did have a short story to send you. Unfortunately, the only ones I have are some rejects from other magazines. I have done very few short stories in the past 3 years because of lack of market for the same. With 4 kiddies, I can't take the time. Although I think that toward the close of my short story production, I began to get a proper approach and feeling for them. I hope to return to them in the next few months. So even by 1960, he had sort of, started to close out on the short story production. He was doing Twilight Zone and screenplays at that time, and he had a wife and 4 children that he was supporting. And the money that you make writing screenplays is massively more than the money you make selling short stories to the magazine. And somewhere I have notes on what he was paid for some of these stories, which you all might find very interesting. So that was kind of interesting. I think. You talked yesterday about Duel, which was, the inspiration for that came on the day that Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and it wasn't published until 1971, so I'm not sure when he actually wrote it up. Well, you said yesterday, he started trying to shop it around as a television.
Yeah, for anybody who doesn't know or is interested, the actual inspiration for Duel, the story of the Dennis Weaver salesman being chased by a psychotic truck driver, was an incident on the day Kennedy was shot. He was playing golf with Jerry Stoll, his friend and colleague, and they were midway through the game and heard that Kennedy had been shot, and he said, well, I'm right, finish the game now. We were driving home, Jerry was driving, and pretty much what happens in the story of the film happened to them, not as extreme, but they were tailgated at high speed through a very narrow canyon by a truck driver who, they don't know why, and for a while it looked like they were in peril of losing their lives, until finally the road widened or something, and they were able to let the guy go by, and they were done. So as soon as they stopped, and it was clear they were going to survive, Richard pulled a piece of mail out of Jerry's old glove compartment, and he wrote a little note saying, write story for Playboy. Guy being chased by, I'm not making this up, guy being chased by a truck, and he said, he was always amused by the fact that, and of course he told Jerry what he was doing, and he said, anybody else hearing him say that, they're gonna, I would remind you, you just almost been killed by this crazy truck guy. What, you're writing this down? And he said, but because Jerry was a fellow writer, he knew exactly what he meant. He said, what did he say? That's the devious, the diabolical writer's mind, then you immediately come up with a story. So it wasn't that simple. As he said, there was quite a long time in between, and apparently in the interim, he made several attempts to try to sell it to TV as an episode of some show. And they all said, that's too limited, nobody's going to want to see that. And so he said, I waste nothing. So he turned it into a short story, published it in Playboy, seen by Stewart's assistants, and drawn to his attention, and the rest is history. But I also don't know when he actually did write it. My assumption is fairly soon, not that long before
close to publication.
It's being published. Exactly. We don't know. So
it's interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's the beauty of Matheson's work, especially why it was so many of the stories were adapted quite successfully for the Twilight Zone, because a lot of it was inspired by actual things that happened. He just upped it up, like he just dialed it up to 12 or whatever. Right? So, because I know that he's mentioned that a lot of other stories that we talked about Woodrow Lost yesterday, about how that one was a real thing that happened to him. And I always find that a lot of his episodes for Twilight Zone are considered classic episodes, and yet a lot of them vary quite differently from the original story. And I know that he wasn't particularly happy with some of that, right?
Well, I think except for the two that Rod Serling adapted from his work before he started writing for the show himself, he was always very complimentary about how closely they followed what he wrote. So if there were changes, I don't think it was so much that he gave them his script and then they changed it and filmed it. It would have been more that for whatever reason, either their request, insistence, or just his own dramatic sense, he might have changed them himself for
I was looking up some of this when I was doing research the other day for the group presentation last night, and I was finding that the guys who were for the Twilight Zone were all very happy with that, and Rod Serling really respected the work of the writers, and pretty much whatever you turned in was what wound up on screen. Matheson was definitely annoyed later in his career with other things where people would change words and revisit things. But he really, really liked the years with the Twilight Zone, and he really liked working with Corman, who also would take a script and just do it and not fuss around with things.
I remember the one specific instance he said annoyed him. He said Twilight Zone pretty much always followed exactly what he wrote. And the example he gave was Phyllis Baxter in The Young Man's Fantasy. Yeah, he said she fumbled around with this dialogue, but that was the only time. And again, as you said about Corman, sometimes they had to cut stuff just because it turned out to be too long. But other than that, he said no, they always did his dialogue work for it. And of course, again, the inevitable exception, which was Peter Lorre in The Raven, and he probably Tales of Terror too. And he said, Peter Lorre, you just sort of give some big approximation of what he said. But he said he was so sweet and dear that he said he didn't care. He just kind of went, But they did talk about, he talked repeatedly, I know, about how what an interesting contrast of styles in terms of the dialogue in The Raven, as he said, well, you had Boris Karloff, who was very old school, the actual background and everything, just exactly the way it's big. And he said, Peter, Vincent Price, excuse me, who had done, all sorts of things. He was a little more flexible in kind of a weird way. And then Peter Lorre just went off in his own direction. And he said Boris Karloff got very frustrated, especially because, if his cue was supposed to be the scripted line of Peter Lorre's and he didn't hear it, he'd be like, or what? So, I don't think there was any animosity, but I'm sure it was a little hard for him to adjust to that. So, but as I said, Vincent Price was kind of in the middle, and he's like, yeah. So, but that's true. That was one of the conspicuous things about the Twilight Zone, not just for Richard, but for all of them. That Serling himself, being such a prominent writer, was extraordinarily respectful of what they did, and they very rarely made any significant change. I know George Clayton Johnson was angry because they changed the ending of a game of pool.
Oh yeah.
Where the maverick player Jack Blair on the show, when he calls back from the dead Jonathan Winters, the master player, to play him, and he challenges him. And at the end of the script, he loses. Jack Blair's character loses, and when they filmed it, Rod Serling didn't like that, so he made Jack Lugman win, which, in a way seems to be the upstuff, save the day. But George Clayton Johnson always argued that it was better to have him lose because he could still go back, he had still the rest of his life ahead of him to improve and get better, and he had something to strive for, whereas if he just wins there, it's kind of, so what? And then when they remade it, during the 80s, it was a new Twilight Zone, one of the many incarnations. And there was a writer's strike, so they couldn't hire new scripts, so they still had the rights owned to being pool. And so they, without George Clayton Johnson's permission, but it turned out to be in the contract, I couldn't stop them. Yeah. They remade it, but they did use his original ending, so it was there. Yeah.
I know the ending for, the original ending for, I think the short story is Long Distance Caller.
Oh, yes.
And then the actual episode is Nightfall, right? I know
yes,
the ending of that, the original story is much creepier.
Oh yeah, that is a case where he did, I think his decision was wise for the show, but the ending, you're right, the ending was very different. And the funny thing is, the story was, it had a third title, which was, I think, not his choice. We're sorry, right number. Then that was imposed by the editor, and then officially in Richard's mind, the story was Long Distance Call, but unfortunately by the time they did it on the Twilight Zone, it had been in Twilight Zone by Beaumont, I believe, called Long Distance Call, and I'm going to use that, and that's how it became Nightfall. But this is where Gladys Cooper, the little old lady living in rural Maine somewhere, Stevie Kingston, she keeps getting these phone calls that turn out to be coming from the local cemetery, and the caller is her.
Spoiler alert! Spoiler alert!
Oh, shall I not? Yeah. Well, the ending was changed anyway, so I won't spoil it. But yes, they are significantly different. That's a very good point.
A lot of the stories wound up with the titles changed by editors, which is kind of interesting, and most of them were changed back when they were, eventually republished in Matheson's collections. If you look on the poster here, all those AKAs are listed on the poster.
Which is a little confusing sometimes.
Yeah. We should take questions.
Yes.
And I have a question for you guys too after that.
Was Third from the Sun his first collection of short stories?
Again, because they paid so much better, that was their preferred market. Of course, at the time, it was known for its prestige fiction, Bradbury, E. Fleming, so Charles Beaumont, etc.
Beaumont was on retainer.
Yeah.
They paid him $500 a month to have rights of first refusal for his short stories.
Wow.
But it was
a fortune.
Was that because of the Ray Russell connection, or?
Russell really liked his stuff. Yeah. I mean, it was because of Beaumont's talent, I think, but his relationship with Russell didn't hurt, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Do you recall the dedication of Third from the Sun?
Who he dedicated? Yeah,
he
dedicated to William Peter.
Yeah,
his creative writing professor. Yeah.
Who's that?
His creative writing professor at the University of Missouri.
At Columbia?
Yes.
Yep. Fascinating.
From whose correspondence it was.
Yeah, I've gone through, there's a whole collection of letters between those two men starting in about 1950 going up until about 1977, and I've gone through all of those, and I wrote about it in here. And the Richard Matheson companion list, I think that.
Yeah, Keaton's widow just passed away a few years ago.
Yeah, how do you know about this?
I'm from Columbia.
Oh, really? All right, I live in Columbia, man. I need to get your contact info.
Well, man.
You're not, are you Dan?
Yeah.
Oh, Dan Beat? It's been forever since I've seen you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we know each other.
Yeah.
Did you have a
I didn't know you were here.
Do you have a question?
You interviewed Matt
Yeah,
at one point.
not exactly a question, I just had an odd cognitive dissonance, and maybe an illustration of how many great writers there were in the science fiction magazines back in the early 50s. I read the story Born of Man and Woman about half a century ago. I usually remember what book I read then, it was a Science Fiction Hall of Fame. But until I walked into this panel, this morning I would have sworn that was a Judith Merrill story.
That's wild.
I mean, I'm a Matheson fan, I just forgot that that was his story.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. A question?
Yeah.
Two-pronged, if you please. You mentioned Matheson's reactions to some of his screenplays. I'm curious what his reactions were to Star Trek work.
You go.
First of all, Matheson and many of the members of the group all contributed to Star Trek in the early days. And he said that the idea originally by Gene Roddenberry was that they would use the finest science fiction authors as contributors. And he said, great idea, he said, but it didn't always work out that well. First, because just because you're a great science fiction author doesn't necessarily mean you're a great science fiction screenwriter. Many of them were, but he said it didn't automatically translate. But he also shared with many of those folks something else in common, which is that he really didn't like all the changes that was made to his Star Trek script he had to within. And in fact, they had a big, not just Roddenberry himself, but he had people working under him, and it was sort of like what we might call today a writer's room or something. And many changes were made. In the case of The Enemy Within, the whole B story of the team stranded on the surface of the planet was not in the script. I forget how the exact mechanism of the script for a long time, but that was completely added by Roddenberry and others, and he didn't like it. I don't like B stories, they give you the hit. So he was definitely not happy about that. I'm not sure he liked what they did with the main story, but I think that was one of the reasons why he never did another episode. And in fact, this is one of the things I find interesting, that although so many of these names, Robert Bloch, Theodore Sturgeon, George Clayton Johnson, who wrote the first episode that was broadcast, Jerry Soule, who wrote the Corbomite maneuver, excuse me. Most of those guys, Robert Bloch did do 3, but most of the other folks, they did only 1, and I think a big part of that was they really just didn't want the interference. So I hope that was just prong 1.
Yes.
Another quick question. I'm here to learn more about Matheson. In my teens, I was aware of a lot of his television, Twilight Zone, Star Trek work, and then the TV movies, Duel, and The Night Stalker. And I think I dovetailed into Matheson with the shock books at my local paper. Were there 4 or more than that? And I understand that there was a 3rd screenplay written for the Night Stalker movies. Was it called Night Terrors?
No, The Night Killers.
Killers, thank you.
That he actually wrote in collaboration with William F. Nolan. And it's an interesting phenomenon because both men worked separately a lot with Dan Curtis of Shadows fame, since we're here television as well. But also they wrote a lot of stuff together, most of which was never produced. But the one thing they did together that was produced was Trilogy of Terror. When the 2 Night Stalker and Night Strangler were so successful, they were planning a 3rd one, which was called The Night Killers. It's about aliens replacing people with android duplicates, which, as he said, as Nolan said, now everybody's on that. At the time, that was a fairly much an idea. It was set Hawaii. So, I forget exactly why, but Richard was busy or something, so they did it together, and he had Nolan do the final version. And then accounts differ as to how close they actually got to production. Some, Nolan, I think, said they were like, about to hop on a plane for Hawaii or whatever, and they suddenly pulled the plug, and I think Danny Curtis said that was nonsense, and they were over here. So, who knows? But
He was just stringing out the writer.
yeah, right.
The screenplay is available in the Kolchak collection by Con.
That was my, and I want you to continue, that was my question, actually, I want you to continue with the detail on that.
Well,
Is there any-
basically, the network suddenly decided that instead of doing a third TV movie, they would do the weekly series, which didn't last very long, but was adored by many of us. So that the screenplay was never shot. Now, interestingly, many years ago, Nolan was going to include it in one of his collections, the teleplay that was never shot. And then at the very last minute, he had to pull it because he found out that Jeff Rice, who wrote the book that The Night Star was based on, still controlled the print rights to the character Kolchak, so he couldn't publish the teleplay. He had an introduction to the teleplay all set, and I think they were, galleys for the book or something, and it got pulled. He was kind of sending me a copy of it. Really, as Paul said, the screenplay teleplay finally did get published. And they published Richard Matheson's Kolchak scripts. All three of them were there, so you can actually read it. But it didn't come out quite as it was supposed to.
My question is there any, I would kill to read that third teleplay.
Well, you
Is there
can.
anywhere besides that, because that edition, I understand, is very difficult to get a hold of now, and out of print from everything I understand.
Oh, it may be.
Is there any other way to read it?
I don't think so, unless, I mean, I think you could find it if you look around on eBay or ABE books, probably. His stuff.
Friday.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
See, I didn't even know it was. Yeah.
It's your library alone, might be able to help you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, that's a good idea. That's a good idea.
I like that down, thank you.
All right, hey, we are in overtime.
All right.
So, thank you guys for dropping some wonderful knowledge on us. Are you?
Please look at the poster before you go. If you have a few
Absolutely.
minutes.
Are you doing other panels this weekend, or where else? What else?
Funny you should ask.
Find you.
No, that's Friday there. I got it. At 1 p.m. Well, that's not us. At 2:30, Paul and I are doing a panel on Matheson's Westerns. At 4 o'clock, he but not I is participating with Matheson, not in the dark, on a Legends of Matheson panel that's going to include I Am Legend and Hell House. And then at 5:30, he and I, with Allie Marie Matheson, Richard's daughter, are going to talk about Someone Time. So yes.
Good. So those are
Lots of Matheson.
those are those are not in this room. So look at the program to find out where those are going to be. But we've got some exciting programs panels for you in this room as well. But yes, thank you, Joe.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Everyone, do me a favor, take a picture of this, please.
Happy to do it.
Yeah, just send it to us, right?
I can. All right, gentlemen.
All right.